Y'all hear me? Okay, cool. My hearing isn't great, so if I'm too soft or too loud, just like hand wave or throw things at me, I'll get the message. Okay, so for last talk, I'll be talking about embedded integration platforms. This is basically where we're bringing third-party software, third-party tools into the interfaces of our own web apps. As we emphasize, really bringing iframes back into the world of developer platforms. That was not intentionally a Justin Timberlake reference. I assure you it's the only time I'm going to do an outdated Justin Timberlake reference for the rest of this presentation, okay? Someone called that out last time. I'm like, that's now the second most dated slide in my presentation. The first being where I have to actually talk about myself. Okay. A little bit of context, basically I've been working on APIs integrations for a very long time. At companies in a good mix of industries, in supply chain, and content management at Box, a lot of B2B, some B2C. I worked in education technology, on drones, and even in the private space industry. I've also worked with quite a range of developer platforms, working on partnerships left and right, and so I've seen a lot of success. And I've seen a lot of many spectacular failures. I've actually had the founders of companies, public companies worth over 10 billion, they just would get on the phone with me to ask about platform strategy and start by just saying, Jeremy, what the heck did we do wrong? So I've seen a lot work and not work in the world of APIs. And we're going to talk about one area that's been kind of undervalued. It has an interesting history. And we're going to get into why things are the way they are in the world of these embedded frameworks, why for a long time we haven't seen them much, and why we have a resurgence today. So we're going to start by getting into just a little bit of the history of APIs. And by history, I mean just the last decade. Basically, when we've seen this API craze, where all the web companies wanted to just open up their service to third-party developers. Things really started to take off in 2009. That's what we call the API craze. APIs were around in web services plenty before. Google had always dabbled in APIs. Facebook launched Facebook Canvas back in 2007. But in 2009, we saw what we call the API craze, just this surge that it continued. I have been working, what I'm most well known for is Box. I joined when it was less than 20, got their developer platform started around 2008, so before the API craze, before APIs got really cool, but I'm not a hipster. Definitely not a hipster. During this time, we saw a lot of experimentation. Some things worked, some things didn't work. Around 2010, 2011, we're seeing a lot of these APIs just not really working out. More companies wanted to build them than they knew actually how to build them. But we figured things out, and there was that momentum. APIs continued to grow. During that time, though, one thing in which we were experimenting seemed to have just fallen off radar. It seemed to have been forgotten really around 2010, 2011, after being part of that big craze back in 2008 through 2010. And that's, well, does anyone remember what this thing was on the left? I'm seeing a few smirks. Hi, Google. What was this thing? For those old enough to remember?
It's like a portal, right? It's portal of iframes, I guess. Right?
Yeah, portal of iframes, like the technical way to explain this thing. Basically, it was an alternative homepage for Google that was really customizable. You could have a custom news module, a weather module, a little email module, and everything was basically, these things could be built by third-party developers and just iframed. Does everyone know what iframes are, by the way? Just okay, yes, I don't have to explain what that is to this audience. So basically, this was just about going crazy on iframes and letting third-party stuff go into a web page. Not around anymore. I was actually top 15 iGoogle gadget developer back in the day, and I watched they were quietly shutting that thing down. Similarly, does anyone remember this thing? Only every once in a while does anyone in the audience remember this one. Okay, this was LinkedIn's response, actually Google's response to Facebook Canvas. You all remember those days when you get like a dozen emails a day from Facebook about some friend became a zombie and bit you, one of those zombie bite apps, because they had those third-party apps right inside the Facebook interface. You could put apps in your profile. So Google responded with something called Open Social. And I actually got to work on integrations with LinkedIn, this thing called Ning, which probably most of you haven't heard of anymore. But basically these other social networks, professional networks, they were all working with Google to have their own equivalent of like iframed apps in their experience. When I was at Box, we built something so you could like create one folder in Box, like post it on your LinkedIn profile. But it was all this iframing kind of thing. And none of it was really panning out, unfortunately. So why wasn't it working out? Well, there were a few reasons. The first just being the perspective that these companies had of like, how do we treat developer platforms? What's the purpose? What's the value that we're providing? Many saw this as a way of making the web work like an operating system, having like the web as an OS. In fact, literally, there were companies doing that with iframes. UOS, this is a fun one, it was a Y Combinator company. They basically made a web page that was going to look like a desktop operating system with like a launch bar. You can install applications and like open them from your desktop and just like do everything in one web page. Cool idea, not very valuable. In the world of APIs as a whole, we started to figure out that the web as an OS was going to be in services talking to each other, but the experience was going to be different. But something else is going on besides this perspective of, how do we treat the web as an OS? Where do these iframed or other means of third-party apps coming into your page, where does it make sense? And a lot of it goes to just treating this with proper product management processes. I have a specialty in APIs, but at its core, I'm a product person. And something I have to always teach in the world of product management is you don't just build what you want to build. You have to listen to your customers. That movie with the quote, if you build it, they will come, it doesn't work in product management. No, you don't just build what you think is cool and just trust that everyone's going to come and want your thing. Okay? Seriously, as Seth Meyers would say to that, really? I mean, really? In the world of APIs, for some reason, people were actually thinking this when product management, the field of product management already established. This isn't what you do when you build any product. But for some reason, we were still thinking this was okay for a developer community. And by the way, the movie where this comes from, what they actually build attracts the ghosts of the White Sox players who took a bribe to throw the World Series. So that actually is kind of like in real life. If you have that mindset, you're not going to attract the right customers. But yeah, in the world of APIs, people were thinking this, and they started to learn to make APIs successful. This is how we continue to have momentum after the 2009 craze. We understood that in order for APIs to be successful, you had to say, okay, what is the purpose of our APIs? What are the problems that our customers have that we can solve through partners, through third-party developers, through a developer community? And then, what kind of apps do they want to build? What apps should they build? And how do we make it as easy as possible for them to build those apps and to enable them to build good apps? Is treating this all like a product problem. So eventually, we got that idea for APIs, and we started to see success. Now, during that time of struggle where APIs weren't really designed accordingly, I would guess the developer community was forgiving. APIs weren't starting off great, but developers could hack around it. Sometimes, the CEO of Twitter at one point a few years ago just started a developer conference by apologizing for the way they were managing their developer program up till then. But what happened with those iframe integrations, things like iGoogle, what we had implemented with LinkedIn, those weren't just focused on the developer community. Those were front-facing to your consumers, to the customers. So when they failed and they had to be quietly shut down, it was much more visible. They tried to shut them down quietly, but it was more painful. The users were affected by it. The companies as a whole were burned by this and had to be more careful. Luckily, we are now seeing a resurgence as APIs finally had gained more adoption by applying product process. some companies have been successful in these embedded frameworks and modern frameworks. So a few examples, we're going to have to especially talk about Google, but Gmail. About a decade after many in the developer community wanted to see it, they finally have Gmail add-ons, where you can build an integration that appears in the Gmail sidebar that Gmail users can find and choose to install to customize the Gmail experience. Another personal favorite, when we get into other examples, is Trello. They basically opened up their interface, really thinking through what are the stories, what are the use cases. Well, we should allow some apps to work at a project board level in Trello and let other apps, like poker planning, just affect a single, at the card level of a project. And they figure out how to enable them based on the use cases where the third party should actually fit. They're not just going to iframe anywhere. They figure out what context makes sense for these apps. Let's apply product process. What's the value here? Where does it make sense to enable a third-party app to fit in our interface? So by applying that kind of product process, thinking through what really is the proper experience, we start to see results. We're seeing a good number of results now. I wrote a series that's getting gradually published on NordicAPIs.com on these types of integration frameworks. There I got to interview Google, Twitch, in the gaming industry. They have some very compelling they have some very compelling experiments in the world of these types of integrations. Shopify, Wix, and okay, Trello didn't talk to me as much recently, those bastards. Now, they talked with me in the past as they launched their platform, and I've gotten to follow what they first launched and how they iterated on their platform. So we're going to talk more here on the user experience, on the developer experience, and on a technical level, what these companies have all learned as they've had success, but as they continue to experiment with these embed frameworks. Because again, there was a lot of time to experiment, but we had this lull as other APIs took off. So in this world, we're still trying to figure out exactly what works. But there are a few things at the highest level that they know to be important to make a platform like this successful. Coming back to product process and use cases. You don't just drop iframes on your interface where they look cool. If you do that, it's going to look like something that was cool in the 1980s. And we all know that the 1980s weren't really cool, it was just really freaking weird back then. It's all about having use cases. And those use cases require data. One thing I got from meeting with the managers of these developer platforms at Shopify, at Twitch, everywhere else, one key pattern, two key patterns actually. A, they didn't launch this kind of a platform until they had a sizable user base. There's a marketplace reason behind that as well, which I'm not going to get into, but they waited until they had a good number of users from which they could get this feedback to say, what do they need? And two, beyond just seeing what the users were asking for, beyond just seeing what kind of problems they have, or maybe we could open up something for a third party in our interface, they were literally watching as customers hacked around their interface, around their products, to make these integrations work when they weren't officially available. In Gmail, many of us, I'm sure, had tried some Chrome extensions, Boomerang, Streak, Chrome extensions that were basically plugging right into Gmail. Trello as well, there were Chrome extensions that were enhancing the Trello interface. These things were very unofficial. Trello and Gmail did not officially support or officially endorse these integrations. Shopify actually had encountered customers who would use their external APIs to basically build like a replica of their interface and then bring third-party tools into their interface there. So they were watching as customers are doing what they can to work around the limitations of their product to know definitively that customers are going to want these kind of integrations. And from those hacks, figure out what parts of the interface make sense. In the case of Gmail, they figured out it makes sense to be in the sidebar and to be in the compose window. When you're responding to an email, when you're sending a message, to be able to, it's kind of hard to see here, but you can now attach files from Box or from Dropbox. There are ways of actually working with third parties right in the compose experience. Also, they're dabbling from a technology standpoint as to what really works well for the user and for the developers. And from a tech standpoint, I like to segment the options into 3 areas. The first being iframes, which is the oldest, the most flexible. We're going to dive into the pros and cons. Basically, everyone makes fun of iframes in this world, but it's still the primary standard. It's what most development platforms apply, where third parties can just drop anything, put any front-end code into your own interface. Next, what we call cards, but what I really categorize is any attempt at not having iframes in your interface. The most common being providing a set of UI components that the platform has defined and that these partners, the developer community can use within this limited set of UI items. And the third that we've learned to really encourage is think about not just letting a partner create something very custom for their interface in yours, like in iGoogle or being in the sidebar in Gmail, but just being part of the flow. For instance, in Google Drive, I can right-click on a file and send it to HelloSign to get signed, or I can send it to eFax to get faxed. In some cases, it opens up a new window entirely. You're just out of Google. There's still some interaction, but it's all happening behind the scenes. And when I was working at Box, we had integration with eFax, where you would fax a file, and you would never actually see the eFax interface. You would just get a message back that the file had been faxed. Shopify does something similar. For their checkout process, they allow third parties now to be part of the checkout, like a coupon kind of app. They don't need it to be in the interface. All they need is to have some stuff happen in the background. But it still fits very well into the user experience in some way through triggers, rather than having a more customized interface. So we're going to dive into all 3 of these from a user experience standpoint, from a developer experience standpoint, and from a technical and security standpoint. The first, generally the elephant in the room, iframes. The most hated and yet most common option. It gives the most flexibility, it's the easiest to set up. You're basically saying to your developer community, create any web pages you want, and we're just going to make it work in our interfaces. A lot of obvious challenges come up here. One, security. Could be a malicious partner, even if we restrict what apps our users are allowed to install. What if our partner gets hacked? And then something happens to what's in the iframe. Also, performance is very common. Does anyone remember Ning, by the way? Okay, I'm not going to get into it too much. Well, it was a create your own social network, basically. And I saw what happened. I saw this issue come up for Ning. I saw it come up for other services who were enabling iframes. If they allow more than one iframe on one of their pages, it would be just a disaster from a performance standpoint. They couldn't rely on the partners to load, even if they load in a timely manner. If you had 4 or 5 apps, if the user installed 4 or 5 of these things, it could take up too much memory. It was really becoming a hassle. So for some, they would say, okay, we're only going to allow in our interface, one integration at a time. Others just had to give up on it for security reasons or for performance reasons. So there's a lot of risk. You're really dependent on the other developers in keeping their apps safe, secure, and performant. And that's a dangerous thing to ask for, because you can't, even if you approve one of these apps to say everything they're doing is right, after the fact they can change what's in that iframe at any given time. And so you can't approve every change that they make. So this creates a lot of risk for security. Now, we can get into other options, but I want to emphasize that there is also a user experience aspect besides security and performance. Very often companies try to move away from iframes just because their security teams say, heck no, we're just not going to allow it. But sometimes there's a user experience reason. And let's take that into account when we look at alternatives. I'm not going to show all of the alternatives that I've seen as others kind of experiment in getting away from iframes. but cards are a very common one. This one's the big one to Google's G Suite team. You'll notice actually if you build an add-on today for Google Docs, they have iframes. Gmail enabled add-ons a little bit later, and they decided we're not going to have iframes, we're going to go with cards. Knowing the team, part of it was that Google is more and more concerned about security, and they just don't want to allow iframes down the road. But a lot of it also is user experience, especially if your service is heavily used on mobile. So, 10 years ago, this was less of an issue. Iframes just made the most sense from a user experience standpoint. But iframes really are not that friendly with mobile applications. So Gmail, by enabling add-ons through, rather than iframes, through this card model, whereby Google says, there are a few kind of UI components that we've defined, you can use those, write some code that happens in the background, but you don't get to customize the UI beyond what we allow. Well, they make sure that those components are mobile friendly. So when you write an app for Gmail, an add-on for Gmail, it can actually work in the Gmail mobile app. Many companies I advise that we're actually building Chrome extensions to integrate with Gmail, I let them know about this to say, you're going to be limited by working with cards. You can't create whatever you want to the interface, but you'll be positioned in Gmail's mobile app. It's a very compelling story. Slack has the same challenge. One key reason why they didn't want an iframe was because Slack is used so heavily on mobile that they wanted to make sure that third-party integrations fit into the mobile app. So they are also going with cards. Big problem with cards, the experience just plain sucks. And all the platform hosts know it, and they're somewhat apologetic for it. They emphasize they're new, they're still figuring out, they're trying to make it more flexible as they gather more feedback. But many developers I know today just gave up and said, as much as we want to be in the mobile apps, we're just going to continue hacking on these platforms with Chrome extensions. Because today it's just, the cards are still just too limited for what many of these apps need to do. So what I want to say when just talking with the hosts of many of these platforms, they acknowledge that cards suck today, and they're working on it. They're still gathering feedback, so if you are interested in building these kind of integrations, hang in there, try things out, share feedback with these platform providers, because again, cards are very new, and we are hopeful that they are going to become more flexible over time to be that iframe alternative. Now, in the meantime, iframes aren't necessarily that bad, especially if you're not as worried about security, if you're a one app at a time kind of experience, performance isn't that big a deal. So what do we do then if we want to be mobile friendly, but we don't want to be so restricted for third-party apps? Well, why not both? And we've seen this happen a few ways. In some platforms, getting smart about this and saying, when you're creating an app with us and you're defining how your app is going to work, where it's going to launch, you can define one interface twice. We'll say that you have one interface for when this thing launches in mobile, and on mobile you're not going to be allowed to use the iframe, you have to use cards, and you can also define your desktop interface that's going to work in the iframe. Intercom actually, they did something else. What they did is they're encouraging people to use the cards experience as much as possible. But when absolutely necessary, you can launch from a card into the iframe. So they're enabling both, but they're encouraging as much as possible developers to stick with cards. By the way, one other reason why these platforms want cards is that when you have iframes, third-party apps building, besides performance, besides security, it's kind of nice if a third-party app has a user experience, as a UI, that's really consistent to the UI of their service. That's one more thing Intercom's trying to do. When you're using cards, these third-party apps just flow very smoothly with the Intercom experience because Intercom's defined the components that the partners can use. But the iframe is still there to enable that kind of flexibility when absolutely necessary. So we have these categories of iframes, cards, triggers. We really want to emphasize that while these experiments continue, you might as well, whether you're working on a platform, whether you're actually building your own platform, don't be exclusive. Think about how you can use more than one thing to enable more for your partners. So, and regardless of whether you're using iframes, triggers, and or cards, there's a lot more to think about. Beyond depth, beyond breadth of those options, let's dive deeper into how to make these kind of frameworks really usable for your users and for your developers. If you just plop iframes in, great, a partner can appear in your interface, and sure, they can make calls to your general external API. That's the basics of these platforms. You let them get iframed in or through cards, and you have a way they can access the APIs you already have. That doesn't translate actually that well. When we think through the stories, where do these experiences really make sense? Some examples here, Google Docs, and I actually have a live demo of this. They're actually thinking through how do we create extra APIs just for those embedded experiences. Let them really interact with the interface in a way that an app that's operating outside of Google Docs wouldn't. In Box's case, with file actions, we had special APIs that allow the apps to just post messages back in the box. In Google's case, they allow, say, for Google Docs, apps to create custom menus in the Google Docs interface. A really simple example here. If I can find the mouse. Okay, so in the world of product management, we have to work between our PRDs, our documents for defining a product, and Trello. We're going to be working with engineers to get these things implemented. So I decided I want to whip up a very simple thing to go from some Google Doc where you have some stuff defined for the business side of things and send things over to Trello. So I whipped up a custom Trello tab. We're going to go to a little bit of code here. There's not much to this thing. Basically, we have some code to just tell Google Docs we're going to create a special menu item, and then I get to, through the APIs, pull out stuff that's right in this particular Google Doc. And then down here, I get to call not even call a Trello API, just actually open up a Trello page to create a card in Trello. So I've created this menu item. And you're going to notice in a moment, there's no iframe here actually. This is more of a trigger kind of integration. It just goes straight to Trello and starts to create a card with the content that I have. A little bit of code working with Google's APIs to interact a little bit more deeply in the Google Docs interface. You can do a lot without iframes. All right, so there's providing those extra sets, that extra set of APIs that just make sense for these kind of integrations. What else can we do? Well, the obvious next step for any APIs is just have SDKs, libraries. What programming languages are most commonly used? Let's just make it easy to plop things right in that language. You don't have to call the APIs directly. For embedded frameworks, it's basically just about having it's usually about just having a JavaScript library. What could happen then is that developers can create an integration that happens entirely in the front end. Sometimes even all this code just gets hosted on the platform. So if I'm writing an app for Google Docs, I actually don't have to host the code myself. I can host it in Google. So it's just about having a JavaScript library first and foremost so you can call APIs indirectly. Disclaimer though, this doesn't work for all platforms. Sometimes you really do not want to allow those kind of API calls to happen in the front end, on the client side. You need to have these happen on the server side. I was once working for an education tech company. It's kind of like Blackboard or Coursera. Basically, it was classroom technology where teachers could, they would manage their classrooms online, they would post homework assignments for students and post their grades in the system. And a teacher could install an app, say a spelling game, and then assign that spelling game to students to go into our EdTech company, our EdTech app, Edmodo, where we would iframe in this, English game, this like a spelling game, and then the student could play the game and would submit a grade to the gradebook. Now, if the API calls, like the grading API call, happen client-side, you can have a student who wasn't great at spelling, but good at programming, and figure out how this app is actually submitting grades to the gradebook. So we had to make sure, sometimes you have to make sure that the API calls do not actually happen client-side. But otherwise it gets very interesting. You have client-side APIs and make it really easy to create these simple apps where you don't have to host any of your own code. Next stage. Okay, we'll be out of time. Next stage, beyond the obvious libraries. This is where we want those higher developer empathy companies to really think this aspect through. How do you make it as easy as possible to create a nice looking app, and also an app that has a more consistent UI with yours? Shopify is really good at this. They have these extra components, UI components. So rather than just have like a text box or a drop down, they have extra things that just make sense within Shopify. And they make it really easy for a developer to call that within their libraries. Their way of saying, I want to enable this type of a feature, this kind of a component. It's still HTML and JavaScript. I can write my own HTML and CSS and JavaScript. But for ease, I want to also use the Shopify component that makes it just a lot easier for me to get certain things done. It also makes it easier for me to create an app in a nice Shopify interface. So if you have a kind of flexible iframed experience, this is about incentivizing, encouraging, rather than forcing developers to build things a certain way. You're making it easier to build, and you're also encouraging developers to design their apps in an interface that works well with the other kind of apps coming in. I was debating whether to make this thing like a 60-minute or a 40-minute or... All right. So we've been talking a lot about the user experience, and how to make, how to position your platform so that developers can build apps that go well with your experience, and enabling the right kind of APIs for developers to build those deeper integrations. We get a little bit also into the developer experience. How do we make it easier for developers to build those kind of apps, to build the better apps? We really have to take both into consideration for these kind of embedded frameworks. Let's focus more exclusively for a moment on the developer experience, not just about making it easier to build apps with the right UI. How do developers just get started? Okay, you really can't see this too well on these slides, but basically, just how Stripe figured out that you need to have better and better documentation. How do we make better developer portals for it to be easier for developers to build apps? A key phenomenon, and kind of an area of debate for all the platform providers, is when we're allowing developers to go beyond those external APIs, to define these apps. They're going to be in our interface. How do they define it? Do they use a manifest? Basically, you say, here's the scope of the APIs we need, here's the name of the app and the images for listing, and here are the views. Where are we going to be displayed in your interface? Have a very flexible way for developers to define how their apps are going to run. They can do that, but we find that for these kind of platforms, usually the integrations are fairly simple, the settings are fairly straightforward, and you don't necessarily need a manifest. There's a certain consistency in what options developers really have. So we don't necessarily need then a text manifest. We could allow developers to just manage their application settings in a simple interface. This isn't too hard to do actually. For one company where we didn't have the engineers to build that interface for a little while, for fun, I just whipped up a simple web page that had a form that could generate the manifest file, based on the settings that we actually had for that platform. So for many, that just makes management of apps much easier. On the other hand, sometimes developers really do want to actually have manifest. Either in the case of like Salesforce's platform, which, long story short, it gets more complicated. There's a lot more flexibility there. It does actually make sense to have a manifest. In other cases where the manifest is more straightforward, in the world of CI/CD, maybe it's more convenient to be able to, as part of the coding process, be able to not just update apps, but update these app settings, change the request for API scopes, change the listing programmatically as part of a release. What we've seen in practice, though, this is actually, what you see to the right is Trello today, Trello's interface today. When Trello launched their platform, what they have, what they call power-ups, their add-ons program, they started with the manifest, and they ended up moving towards the interface. Fairly consistently, that's what I see. I've not actually seen platforms that start with like an app management interface and instead switch over to the manifest. Part of the reason behind this is that when you are building an app for these kind of frameworks, you can't just automatically update your settings in a manifest and just trust that it's automatically going to go and apply to all your users. There's usually an approval process. So certain steps are going to be manual anyways, that we find it's just easier to allow the settings just be edited in a nice UI. Something to think about. Do we want this to be easy in the developer portal, or do you want to have that create a manifest, make it part of your app, make the app a little bit more complex to build in the bundle? So we've gone into the user experience, the developer experience, talked a bit about how there are security issues, especially with the dreaded iframes. But let's talk about some specific security considerations. Now we can alleviate things. Actually alleviate pain points sometimes for the iframes as well. So HTML5 has also made iframes a little bit safer and a little more comfortable for security teams. Basically because we have additional settings now. You know, it used to be that for iframes, partners could do whatever the heck they wanted, you had no control. In fact, when I was at Box back in the day, 10 plus years ago, yeah, I'm that old, HTTPS, SSL, that kind of security wasn't expected on all sites. Even in B2B, sometimes we only had HTTPS at login. And as it became more common, well, what happened when you brought a third-party app in? It was actually possible for these secure enterprise sites that were HTTPS enabled to allow non-secured sites to be embedded in an iframe. They've at least moved beyond that. Browsers by default don't allow it if you're on an HTTPS site now. Anything iframed in has to be HTTPS as well or it will not be displayed. But HTML5 has enabled more. So you can prevent iframed apps from having pop-ups, which may just be annoying to your users. You can actually prevent things like, you can even prevent scripts. Unfortunately, many of these security settings still, they only do so much because realistically, we're not going to be able, we don't want to block third-party apps from running scripts on our site. Sometimes we want to, but it provides still too much restriction. So we're still dealing with that, what restrictions are okay for our users and our developers in exchange for that security, but without breaking things in the user experience. So this is why this alleviates some pain points for iframes, but it's why we're still trying to look at other things. Mix and matching cards with iframes. And we'll look into some future technologies as well. Big thing I have to emphasize that many platforms have forgotten about. And I'm not going to name too many names here. Well, I'm going to try not to name names, but it's always tempting to name names here. In the case of Google Docs, let's say I want to right-click on one file and send it over to HelloFax to fax. You know what HelloFax needs to do? They need to just be able to read files in Google Docs, in Google Drive. In fact, they don't need to read files. They just need to read the one file that I selected and sent to HelloFax. Maybe it's an image editor. Okay, the image editor should be able to overwrite files, but they only need to be able to overwrite the one file I selected. There's no reason for that app to have to see everything that's in my Google Drive folder. Unfortunately, many platforms haven't actually thought through scope. Thanks to Facebook's Cambridge Analytica scandal and other security scandals, they're starting to think this over more. So yes, in Google Drive's case, some apps will request full access, but we have now established scopes specifically for these embedded apps, so that some of these apps can request to only have access to one file, the file that you've sent. In Trello's case, only have access to the board that you're on, or maybe even only have access to the card that you're on, and if you need more permission, well, you better alert the user that it is asking for more permissions. So when we're opening up these kind of frameworks now, we're thinking through how scoping in the APIs have to be applicable specifically to these kind of applications. I want to also just look forward in the future. We talked about a lot of security issues with iframes. There's basically that trade-off of cards just plain suck, it's too limited to integrate. Iframes have security. Is there anything else we can do besides combining the two for different scenarios? Well, we are very hopeful for something called AMP. We're seeing this now in Gmail. It's allowing your emails to actually be more interactive. And it's basically HTML plus CSS plus JavaScript with some basic limitations. It's designed to be more mobile friendly. It's designed to just be safer than fully open iframing. Overall, it just doesn't suck as much as iframes. Free HTML. It also doesn't suck as much as cards because you still have freedom to write your own HTML and CSS. I can't say who exactly among those platforms we've spoken with about this. Fairly consistently, what I'm hearing is, I haven't seen AMP actually enable for third-party developers to say, rather than just iframe in anything, rather than use cards, let's use AMP. But I can say that all the platform providers, or at least most of them, they're thinking about it. They're looking into AMP. So we're very hopeful for the future to see something that's just generally more friendly. For now, we're still working with iframes and cards, but everyone's on the lookout as we continue to experiment. Also, something to think about is everyone familiar with Swagger or OpenAPI? Raise your hand if you're not familiar. Okay, so basically when we're building APIs today, we mostly build, if we're building APIs under RESTful guidelines, basically an object-oriented kind of structure, we can now use something like Swagger or OpenAPI to define the APIs. It's basically a standard. It's a means of defining your API in a standard way. And that allows for APIs to be designed consistently. With that, it's easy to create documentation automatically. It's easy to create your SDKs automatically. And it also makes it easy for companies who are integrating with many different APIs, just kind of plug in if all the APIs are kind of consistent. So what if we had something like that for embed frameworks? Okay, we actually did at one point. It's just that nobody liked it. Open Social, anyone remember that thing? Exactly. Let's assume there's really nothing out there right now. But in the ideal, we could have standards like this, whereby I'm actually writing an app for one service that's just portable to another. In fact, if they even in the standard have UI components, I could design an app, call some JavaScript functions, where it's the same code looking differently in different platforms, consistent with those frameworks. Imagine that right once launch anywhere. This is of high interest, and as I've spoken with all these platform providers, we're still experimenting, said every single one of them. Basically, they want to see standards. It's too early. They're just starting to get success. They're still dabbling in, would it be a card standard? Would it be an iframe and JavaScript function standard? We're not sure yet. They all want to see it, but they all have to still get cards right or get AMP right, something to make sure, like, this is what's working really well, and then we can go to our standards. How much time would you say we have? Do we want to have a hard stop?
You're good. You can take 10 more minutes if you want.
Okay, we also want to have time for Q&A though.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll take a few more minutes. We're going to jump over a few slides. It's also a matter of interest, but no one was chucking WASP paper on you, so I assume you're still interested here. All right, I got time here to show a couple more slides. All right, so before we wrap up, I have room for a few other tips and some interesting things to consider for these platforms. We talked about the JavaScript library, how if you do that, things can run client-side. And if things are running client-side, it's pretty easy to actually host the code yourself. So theoretically, like a developer portal, the developer can come in and say, here's my code. So you can just run the code. It gets to be very interesting, and Twitch is especially working on this. Their point about code hosting isn't just to make things easier for developers, that they don't have to host the code themselves. But considering that Twitch is owned by Amazon, they're kind of big on hosting things themselves because they know that their servers are going to be really reliable. They don't want to have to rely on the third-party developer to have a good means of hosting apps. So their system is basically designed such that, as a developer, I can initially enter URL and host the code myself and test everything out. But when I'm ready to launch, they really want they're really pushing their developers to just post all of that code into Twitch. It's very easy to do if all the code runs client-side. I mean, ask Twitch, though, what happens if they have some server-side code? Are you going to take the chances yourself and actually host all of this server-side? I've seen a few efforts at some pretty intense server-side systems like Salesforce's Apex. That's going to be a whole set of lectures, and you can write a whole course on hosting code server-side in your system, so we're not going to get into that. But Twitch did want to handle what they say is like 80% of cases. If an app needs to store some data and do something server-side, in many cases, it's about having just a very simple database. So they have an API to just store some metadata, like a JSON blob, in your app. So most of the code is still client-side, but within your app, you allow to call some APIs, just store some data just for your app. A very basic set of APIs then allows many, many developers to basically write their code entirely client-side, and then call some extra Twitch APIs to store some stuff in Twitch and extract it. And that allows the developer to not have to worry about hosting, and Twitch to not have to worry about partners hosting their own code. Because Twitch, again, they got Amazon. They have their own system. They trust their own system. Also like to dabble on allowing your own integrated apps to have their own APIs. I did this at TradeShift. I've seen Salesforce do it. Basically, you're saying that a user, when they install two different apps, they can get the apps to talk to each other. If they're storing data on your system, well, maybe that data should be accessible just to my app. Maybe it should be okay for that extra data, maybe that metadata, to be accessible to other apps. So Salesforce actually allows developers, when they're defining these integrated apps, to actually set their own API endpoints and then document that so that someone can go and a customer can go and install two different apps and let them talk to each other. This is one of those potentially more cool than valuable kind of things. I've conceptualized it for several platforms that I've worked for, and I really emphasize, don't do it until you have a lot of users using these apps, and consequently a lot of apps, and then you start to see apps say, I actually would like to work with that other app, or I'd be fine sharing some data that maybe another app can use. You need to get to the point where this is actually a problem for your developer community, because the vast majority of your app developers will not be interested in this. There's no need to do this until you have a sizable developer base to actually justify it. You also may see beyond that basic JavaScript library, companies actually defining their own kind of markup language. Salesforce had their, I forget what they called what Salesforce's markup language is actually called. Well, yeah, it was part of Salesforce Lightning. Facebook once had FBML. I've actually seen a lot of these just not work out. often they're just kind of more of a pain point for developers who still want to write stuff in their most basic language, just use JavaScript libraries. Salesforce is actually big on this. Beyond using just JavaScript libraries, you can actually create like components in your HTML and just plop those in. It's one more thing to dabble in, but I emphasize, if we look at Salesforce, Salesforce waited a while before launching this. It took a lot of experimentation, it took a lot of data, and this isn't just data of users wanting these apps, this is data of saying, okay, we have a sizable developer community. Is this actually something that our developers are going to want? More often than not, they're not going to want something this heavy. Most developers are going to be happy writing in HTML, CSS, using their own stuff, and then calling some JavaScript to get some UI components. But it's something to think about down the road. Down the road. A big emphasis on this. I've seen a lot of platforms launching some pretty cool stuff before getting the feedback. So that's why I save these items actually only for if we have like more than 30 minutes in the talk, because I have to give disclaimers. These are cool ideas, you may see them in some successful platforms, but they come along at a later stage. So there's a lot of stuff to think about when running these platforms, a lot that we're still experimenting with. And you do have to phase it when we're launching platforms. I basically just say, just keep right here. Hopefully we're going to see this work out a lot better, and maybe one day we're going to actually see in Gmail something that's not just add-ons, card-based add-ons, that allows you to have a calendaring app that actually has the experience that we want. Sorry, I do make fun of Gmail's calendar integration right now. If you want the basic, like, let me schedule something with someone, we still can't do that. But as these stories solidify, as the platforms solidify, we're going to hopefully see more and more. So keep experimenting and just keep looking ahead as we're finally seeing opportunity here. All right, so that's all of my yapping away at how much I hope that these frameworks will continue to grow. Any questions? Well, thank you all for putting up with me for a big amount of time.
Any questions?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just lost in thought. I've just been reading about differences between responsive web design and AMP, which is probably a whole other topic, but if you had like a 10-second hot take on that, or
Responsive web design
versus like AMP. I tried to work with responsive web design. I just didn't. Yeah, it seemed like a lot of extra work for. But
I've actually been asked this one before. It could be a very long thing. Like my initial high-level take is just AMP, while still very early, seems to be just a nice way of working with what we already know, the basics, just limiting it, keeping it safer, keeping it simpler. Yeah, I think it's going to enable. What I've seen in responsive web design is mostly enabling the mobile experience. For AMP, it's beyond the mobile experience. It's a lot of just making those who are uncomfortable with allowing anything in your interface to be comfortable, safe enough.
okay. Thank you.
I have a question. So, as someone who doesn't really know much about iframes and the cards, but if somebody, say, wants to know more about it, would you recommend to start learning the iframe, then cards, then AMP, or?
So, AMP, I wouldn't. If you're trying to build in these platforms, don't think about AMP right now.
Okay.
It may come up down the road. I would look at iframes and cards. The deal with iframes is basically, do you know how to create a web app? Do you know how to call APIs? There's not much else to it. The cards, there isn't much other than if you're interested in building something for Gmail add-ons or for Slack or for Shopify, you have to look into how they define their cards. Each of them have their own way of creating cards, have their own definitions of these cards. Since there isn't a standard yet, it's basically look into which platform you're thinking of building something and then saying, okay, what are they allowing? Especially considering they are all updating their cards over time. But yeah, cards in Slack are different from cards in Gmail. So it's about looking at the documentation for that particular platform and how they want it to work. Anyone else? Alrighty.
All good?